Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the Sagas of Swamp Thing podcast. Today we are reading issue number 16. But first, just a little catch-up before we get into that. In the last issue, Swamp Thing was on the run from Matt Cable, Abby, and Bolt, who were trying to find him, but he did not want to be found, and he ended up stumbling into a clearing and being found by a priest. So the priest brought him into his church, and we found out that this priest decided to turn to black magic in order to bring about Armageddon, and he's hoping that God will come down and stop Armageddon, and that will prove the existence of God to all of his followers who stopped going to his church. And as part of that, he brought forth a demon named Nibiros, who ended up wanting Swamp Thing's body for possession because he needs it to bring forth the apocalypse. So Nibiros actually does that. He possesses Swamp Thing's body, and unfortunately, Matt Cable, Abby, and Old Man Luke find him, but they don't know he's possessed. So Swamp Thing ends up knocking them out, bringing them into the church, and I guess as part of the ritual to bring the apocalypse forth, he needs souls. So he starts with Luke, he kills Luke by taking out his soul and eating it, basically. And the priest is actually horrified by this because he didn't think that was going to happen, I guess. So he begins reading from the book, trying to take Nibiros out of Swamp Thing's body. And while he's doing that, that of course distracts Nibiros and smashes the orb that Nibiros had Alec Holland trapped in. Then we got this big epic fight where Swamp Thing, now not possessed, fights this traditional looking demon with, red skin and horns and all that. And it ended with Father Bliss actually taking the demon into him and letting himself be possessed. And then he was able to will himself back into control enough for Nibiros to burn up inside of him. And then the whole church collapsed, and Matt Cable, Abby, and Swamp Thing got out. And they thought it was over, but as they look up in the sky, they saw a helicopter that looked a lot like the Conclave's helicopter from the beginning of this volume. And hanging from it was Bolt. I think I forgot to mention, but Bolt had got off on his own in the swamps to find Swamp Thing, and he was captured by this helicopter there. And that's where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, we got the cover of issue 16. We see Swamp Thing trapped between two different groups of threatening people. Behind him are police officers with rifles. In front of him are what look like zombies. And he kind of looks like he doesn't know what to do. And next to him is a priestess who seems to be pointing towards the police officers, almost like she's beckoning the zombies towards them. So as we turn to the first page, we see an airplane flying in the sky, and it is surrounded by stormy clouds. And in this panel, the narration says, "Angry clouds paint the early winter dawn a chill gray, framing a churning 747 in a nimbus of turbulent haze. But the fury of nature can only pale before the conflict occurring within this great metal bird, for therein roils a most human tempest, one called terror." Then we cut to the inside of the plane, and we see Matt Cable and Abby, and they're looking very alarmed as they turn around to see a man with a gun who is trying to hijack the plane, and he has taken a stewardess hostage. And of course, Matt Cable is not one to just sit by and let this happen, so he's about to move, but Abby holds him and says, "Matt, don't!" Then we hear the hijacker say, "That's right, hero, sit down, because if anyone follows me, the little lady here gets her brains splattered over half the Caribbean, dig?" And even though it said this was a 747, there is for some reason a door on the back of it that says cargo. So the hijacker takes the stewardess back there and slams the door, and Cable tries to make a move again, but Matt holds him still and says, "Please, Matt, that skyjacker's a maniac. He'll just kill you and the girl." And a frustrated Matt replies, "I know, Abby, but I just feel so blasted helpless." Then we cut to the inside of the cargo hold, where we see the gunman is putting on a parachute, and he's saying to the stewardess, "This $500,000 the airline forked over in Miami will go a long way, baby. Too bad you can't come along and help me enjoy it, but this game's for keeps. And you're one of the bridges I gotta burn behind me, so..." And then he clicks back the hammer, and he aims the gun at the stewardess, and she begs, "No, please." And at that exact moment, it turns out that the box they were standing next to in the cargo hold is where Swamp Thing was traveling on this plane. So of course, hearing all this, he bursts through the wood side of the crate, and he yells, "No!" And of course, the skyjacker is very scared, and he says, "What? Oh my dear lord!" And the funny thing about this crate is that it actually says Swamp Thing Fragile on the top of it, so the skyjacker really should have known what he was standing next to. We also see on this page that the name of this issue is Night of the Warring Dead, and it is written by David Michelini with art by Nestor Redondo. So of course, the hijacker brings the gun up and points it at Swamp Thing and yells, Get away from me! Get away! And as he fires into Swamp Thing's shoulder, of course it doesn't do anything, and Swamp Thing thinks, hadn't counted on coming out of hiding so soon. But I couldn't just sit around and watch someone get murdered. And then he grabs the hijacker by the arm and makes the gun fall out of his hand, and he continues thinking, guess I'll never make a good New Yorker, eh, friendly? We also see the stewardess is on the ground behind Swamp Thing. I guess she passed out, although she could have been knocked out by Swamp Thing, who burst from the cargo box. And as Swamp Thing holds the man still, he sees the stewardess and he thinks, good thing the stewardess fainted. She'll probably pass me off as hysteria when she comes to. Only, what do I do with you, now that... But his thoughts are cut off by Turbulence, who throws him off balance, and he begins to fall backwards towards a door, and he's still holding on to the hijacker. And of course, Swamp Thing is pretty heavy, so when he hits that door, it doesn't hold him at all. It just totally comes out, and Swamp Thing and the hijacker tumble out into the air. So as they're free-falling, the narration says, like stones, the two grappling forms plummet through the lashing wind and rain, until a desperate hand clasps a metal ring, pulls, and finds... Then we see the parachute open, but unfortunately, the strings that are attaching it to the man's back begin to snap, and he yells out, the parachute! It can't take the weight! We're gonna die, damn you! Die! Then we get a panel of a very terrified Swamp Thing, and it kind of zooms in on his face, and the narration says, it's said that at the moment of death, one's entire life passes before his eyes. But for the hapless swamp monster, this parade is confined to the events of the last 24 hours, and it begins in a stagnant Louisiana marsh. And with that, we begin a flashback just to show exactly what happened between the last issue and this one, because the last one ended with Matt Cable, Abby, and Swamp Thing just in the middle of the swamp. So we see Matt Cable and Abby getting into a Jeep, and Matt Cable saying to Abby, come on, if that freaky helicopter that snatched Bolt is what I think it is, then our hot-blooded friend is in trouble. Bad trouble. And then he turns to Swamp Thing and says, and though I don't really have any right to ask you to come along, Alec. But Swamp Thing reaches out and puts his hand on Alec's shoulder, and he stares at him and he thinks, don't worry, Matthew. This is my fight as much as it is yours. And Matt Cable is staring back at him understandingly, even though he didn't hear any of that, that was all in Swamp Thing's head. Then in the next panel, we see a large crate being loaded into this plane, and the narration says, and so, with the quarry hurriedly tracked to a private island nestled in the Caribbean, the quest had begun, with special preparations being made for our most unusual passenger. Then we see the moment that the skyjacker grabbed the stewardess and pulled out his gun, and the narration says, only chance had had the last laugh, as an unexpected element had entered the game. A memory that mocks, even as the memory dissolves, back to the cold, harsh sting of reality. So Swamp Thing and the hijacker plummet towards the water, and the parachute might be slowing them down a little bit, but for the most part it's not doing anything. And just as they're about to hit the water, Swamp Thing thinks, water, coming up fast. Got to try to land first. Cushion the blow so that... No, it's no good. We're falling too fast. Going to... So Swamp Thing is unable to shift it so that he hits the water first, and when they do crash into the water, it's presumed that he is killed. I mean, both he and Swamp Thing's bodies do float to the surface, but the bodies drift apart, pushed by the ocean waves and currents. And over these panels, the narration says, the sea is still, surprisingly calm in that storm that rages about. But for two bobbing, unmoving figures, the storm is over. Like some great misshapen flotsam, the unconscious Swamp Thing drifts, unaware of the soft undulation of the waves, of the eventual grating of sandy shore on mossy hide, and of the dark, sinister shadows that greet his unceremonious arrival. So we see Swamp Thing's body wash up on a shore, and as his unconscious body lies on the beach, we see two pairs of legs appear. One is a woman's legs, and the other is a man's. Then we turn the page, and we cut to a different scene completely. There's some text that says, Otherwhere, number 1. And then there's narration that says, a hidden jungle sanctuary several miles away. So in this panel, we see Bolt is strapped to like an electric chair inside of some sort of laboratory, and there is a scientist and also a man in a wheelchair, but we can only see the chair and part of a hand and a leg. No face, so we don't know who this man is yet, but we do hear him say to Bolt, your will is strong, my dear Bolt,
but I assure you my will is stronger. You will save us all much unpleasantness if you will tell me what I want to know."
But Bolt ain't no snitch, so he tells the man in the wheelchair, "Spread butter, fat man." And the man in the wheelchair replies,
"Very well, Mr. Bolt. It's your mind. Continue the treatments, Dr. Pretorius."
And the doctor answers, "Yes, sir." And with that, he must push a button or something because we see Bolt wincing in pain, like he's being electrocuted or something. Then we cut back from that scene to Swamp Thing on the beach, and as he comes to, the narration says, "A gentle graze of fingertips on root-tangled brow, and awareness returns to a weak and shaken man-brute." And as Swamp Thing sits up, the woman says, "Look at him, he's coming to." And as Swamp Thing weakly opens his eyes, he thinks,
"Who? Where?"
And then he stares up at the two figures that are standing in front of him, and we get for the first time the full body shot of the woman and the man standing next to him. Both of them are white people. We do see that the woman is wearing a kind of strange garb. She has basically a long loincloth and a strategically placed wrap around her top. And she has very long black hair, and she's wearing some sort of headdress, and she's also adorned with gold jewelry on her wrists and hips, and she even has like a chest piece and an anklet. And looking very different, the man is wearing basically like a guerrilla military uniform. So he's wearing brown combat boots and blue jeans and a brown shirt and a brown beret. And he is holding an assault rifle, and he has a knife and a canteen on his belt. And as Swamp Thing looks up at them, she says to him, "Easy now, you're among friends. You were found on a beach and brought here while I used certain abilities to touch your soul, and find that you are as much of an outcast as we are. For you see, you are on the island of Calapago, in the camp of the People's Liberation Army. This is Adam Rook, and I am Lagana, High Priestess of the people of Sep." It seems that as she was talking, Swamp Thing's eyes were getting wider. I'm not sure if it's because he was ogling her and the way she's dressed, or if he was listening to her and surprised at what she said. But it's probably the second one, because she says, "Don't look so surprised. Revolution always casts people in strange roles. So why not a priestess and a general? But perhaps an explanation would ease some of your confusion. You see, it's really quite simple. My people are old, older than these sands, some say, and with age has come great knowledge and power. But power, even when used for good, is often feared, especially by those who seek it themselves. So when the island's government was overthrown some weeks ago, the new leader sought to stabilize their rule by eliminating any potential threats, and unfortunately, one of those threats was my people." Then we see Lagana reach down to her neckline, and she holds up the pendant on her intricate gold necklace, and she says, "I alone survived, along with this talisman, the sole remnant of my people's power. But it will be enough to return the rule of Calapago to the people. And perhaps, my friend, you will join us in our crusade." But Swamp Thing isn't really in any kind of condition to make big decisions, so he thinks,
"Sorry, lady, but revolution isn't exactly my,
And then he almost passes out. And Lagana rushes over and puts a hand on his shoulder to steady him, and she says, "Easy there. You're still weak, and there are traps set around the camp that even you might not wish to stumble upon." And then Swamp Thing uses a tree to slowly stand to his feet, and as she walks away from him, she says, "So you just rest a while. Consider my proposition. Adam will see to any of your needs while I make certain preparations." So as Lagana leaves, we see Adam just kind of stand there awkwardly as Swamp Thing steadies himself on the tree. But finally, I guess to break the ice, Adam says to Swamp Thing,
"You'll have to excuse my awkwardness, fella. I've fought through a lot of swamps in my time, but I've never tried to talk to one. But you don't like fighting, do you? Well, I can't say I blame you much. I don't either." And Swamp Thing just kind of stares at him, and so Adam continues saying, "So then what am I doing here, 1,000 miles from nowhere, fighting in some 2-bit revolution I could care less about? Well, that's a long story. But seeing as you seem to be having trouble holding up your end of the conversation." Then we cut to a flashback where we get a couple panels of Adam in Vietnam, and then also him returning home. And over these panels, his narration says, "The whole mess started when I joined the Marines some years ago. Thought I'd be a regular John Wayne. Only a few months in Nam taught me that the real dying ain't quite so glorious as it is in the movies. But I learned soldiering all right. Learned it real good. And when the war was over, the folks back home had no end of medals and kind words for me. Only what they didn't have was a job, or any particular concern when all the hoopla was over. Nope, there wasn't much demand for trench diggers and snipers in Minnesota. And under that panel, we get him standing in the employment office, but it looks like there's no jobs for him. Then in the next panel, he's walking down the street, and he sees a standee that says, "Find your future in the Army." And the narration continues. "Even the service didn't want me back without a war. Seems I'd served my purpose, and the country didn't have no more use for me. But why should they? Hell, all I done was risk my life for them." Then we get a panel of Adam fistfighting on a ship in the middle of the ocean, and the narration continues saying, "So I ended up in the Merchant Marine, and things went smooth for a while, except it seems the only place a fighting man's at home is in a fight. So I was, at liberty in the islands when I heard about the overthrow on Calapago. Figured the revolutionaries would jump at a chance for a mercenary with my background, only I hadn't counted on the, brevity of local disagreements." And in the panel under this narration, we see him being tossed out on the street by a couple of armed men in uniform because, as Lagana said, the overthrow of the government only lasted like a week. And Adam's narration continues. "Seems I was a bit late for the war. That's when I met up with Lagana. I had the military skills she was looking for, and she had what I needed, a war." Then we get a panel of Adam leading some men that look pretty disheveled and ragged against the government men in uniform, and Adam's narration says, "I'll admit her methods, to say nothing of her army, set me back a bit at first. But after you've seen all the battlefield leftovers I have, nothing shakes you up for long." And then Lagana walks up again, and she says, "Something tells me our friend has known his share of horror too, Adam. Perhaps enough to make ours seem pale in comparison. But tonight, we may have a chance to end one kind of horror. Come." So Swamp Thing and Adam follow her just outside the camp, and the narration over this panel says, "Tension rides the soft jungle breeze as it follows the mismatched trio along a short, twisting pathway. And just as they crest a hill, we see a bunch of gravestones, and Swamp Thing thinks, 'A graveyard?' And then Lagana turns to him and says, 'Here in this fetid place lie the remains of those who fought tyranny on our island, but had the ill fortune to die on the losing side. And it is here where our army lies, for it is their spirit of freedom that is our strength.'" And Swamp Thing puts a couple things together in his head, pretty much what Adam told him about the army that he was leading for Lagana being kind of ragtag, and Lagana just saying that this is where her army lies. So he makes a leap of logic, and he thinks, "An army of spooks. I should have known. They're just two loonies out in the jungle with delusions of..." But his thoughts are cut off as all of a sudden shooting begins and someone yells, "Look, there they are, and they've got some kind of monster with them." And as Lagana and Adam begin to dodge bullets, Adam says, "Government troops! They must have trailed us from the armory we raided." So the soldiers rush up to Swamp Thing, but of course he just knocks them away like nothing, and as he does that he thinks, "Well, loonies or not, those two helped me, and anyway, I was never a big fan of self-proclaimed dictatorships." So Swamp Thing knocks all the soldiers to the ground, and he gives Adam and Lagana time to escape. So they run away, but Swamp Thing doesn't really see where they go, so he takes off in his own direction, and unfortunately, he steps on a tripwire, which triggers a trap, and we see a tree branch that was under tension swipe out of nowhere and smack Swamp Thing in the back of the head. And Swamp Thing just stands there for a second, and we see the soldiers begin to recover around him, and then Swamp Thing falls to the ground face first, completely unconscious. And the narration says, "There was a moment of tender pain, and then the soft velvet blackness of limbo." And one of the men yells, "The beast! It no longer moves! Quickly, bind it!" Then we see some of the soldiers grab some rope. Then we cut to a completely different scene where we see Matt and Abby standing, I assume at the airport, staring at Swamp Thing's shipping container that he is no longer in, of course. And we get some text that says, "Otherware number 2." And the narration says, "While on a separate island." And as Matt and Abby stare at the splinters of the side of the box that Swamp Thing broke out of, Abby says to Matt, "Well, what now?" And Matt answers, "It's a question of priorities, Abby. We started out looking for Bolt, and that's still our prime objective. It's what Alec would want. And anyway, I think Alec can take care of himself. Then we cut to Swamp Thing in a jail cell, and he is chained to the wall, and the narration says, ironic words, as for the second time in less than a day, a slime-draped monstrosity claws away the pall of unconsciousness. And as Swamp Thing begins to wake, he notices the chains around his wrists, and he looks up at the wall and he thinks, chains! Some kind of jail! And as he stands, he begins to try to pull the chains that are attached to the wall, and he thinks, well, I'm sorry, but I find this muck-rotted body of mine prison enough for one man, and I'm not about to subject myself to any other! And then he pulls with all his might, and the plate that secures the chains to the wall breaks free, and the jailers scream out, the monster! It's escaping! Call the soldiers quickly! Then we cut to the graveyard, and it is nighttime now, and we see Adam and Lagana are standing in front of a giant full moon, and Lagana is holding up her talisman, so it looks like she's about to do some magic, and the narration of this panel says, while in the jungle, a dark, clinging fog slips silently between crumbling headstones, as a pale moon etches wan shadows over a once hallowed ground. And Lagana says to Adam, the time has come. Then she holds up the talisman towards one of the gravestones, and we can see it begin to shake, and the narration says, softly, like the call of some trilling nightbird, a melodic chant rises from the young girl's throat, spilling words of a race long forgotten among the ancient graves. And with a dark rumble of their own, the graves answer. Then we turn the page and we cut back to town, where we see Swamp Thing is smashing through the walls of his prison to the outside street. And of course, all the soldiers rush immediately, and they yell, the beast! It tears through the stone as if it were paper! And as they run at him with their rifles drawn, Swamp Thing, of course, just begins punching them and knocking them all down, and he thinks, everywhere I go, I'm used or beaten or chained, and frankly, I've just about had it. Then we cut back to the graveyard, and we see a bunch of dead hands coming up from the ground, and they are reaching out towards Lagana, who seems to be kind of in control of them. And the narration over this panel says, the chant continues, and the raven wind whips about the headstones, as if in righteous indignation, as slowly, like obscene worms, pallid, half-rotted fingers spike upwards through the moist soil, and with a shallow moan, the maggot-ridden corpses of those long dead rise from the ruptured soil, rise to follow the command of the arcane talisman, but rise no longer as corpses, for now they live. Then we see a bunch of undead zombies following Lagana and Adam as they walk towards the town. Then we cut back to the Swamp Thing fight, where he is pummeling all of these guards and soldiers, and he's thinking, if I can just wade through these overzealous Boy Scouts and reach the jungle, I can... But his thoughts are cut off as one of the soldiers turns around and sees Lagana and this army of the undead, and he yells, "Ay, El Muerto! El Muerto!" And as Swamp Thing turns to see what the man is yelling about, the narration says, shock ices the embattled plaza with a gaze of tremulous fear, causing even the Swamp Thing's misshapen spine to spasm in involuntary shudder. And as Swamp Thing looks at the undead approaching, he thinks, oh my dear God! And of course, all of the soldiers stop attacking Swamp Thing, and they immediately start shooting at the undead zombies. And as the two armies clash, the narration says, and then they meet, the army of the once dead and the army of the soon dead, and those who would call it slaughter would be too kind. And as Swamp Thing watches this carnage, he thinks, Lord, no one deserves to die like this. I can understand Lagana's motives, but there has to be another way. There has to be. And then he looks behind him and he sees Lagana, who is not hiding or anything during this battle. She is standing very tall and she is almost happy to see this happen. And as Swamp Thing sees her, he thinks, the talisman. She said it was the root of her power. Got to get to it and stop this horror. So Swamp Thing walks over to Lagana and she smiles as he approaches and she says, ah, my strange friend, I'm glad you've decided to. But before she can finish her sentence, Swamp Thing reaches out quickly and he grabs the talisman on her chest and she exclaims, what? The talisman? You mustn't! And Swamp Thing thinks, yes, Lagana, I must. For the sake of sanity, I must.
And then he pulls it from her neck and he smashes it in his hand. Then all of a sudden, the zombies stop moving, and the narration says, with a sudden jerk, the once dead soldiers stop, and if one could read emotion on their grave-scarred features, one might see them suffused with regret. And then, with a soft, trembling sigh, they crumble to the scarlet-streaked earth, their dust and moldering bones mingling with the shattered remnants of a young girl's dreams. So like I said, we see all of the undead turn to dust and fall to the earth. And as Lagana watches this, she begins to cry and she says, "We've lost Adam. It's over." But Adam can't accept that. He chambers around into his M16 and he says, "Maybe for you, lady, but not for me." And as he begins to walk towards the remaining soldiers, Lagana says, "Adam, what are you?" But Adam cuts her off saying, "It's the system, Lagana. On this island, in the States, wherever, it's all the same. They push you around, stick you in a niche, and if that doesn't work, they kill you. It's something you can't fight with guns, Lagana. But that's all they've taught me. And now, God help me, it's all I know." And then he rushes towards the soldiers and begins firing, and of course they fire back at him, and as Lagana yells, "Adam!" he is struck by multiple rifle bullets. And as he falls to the ground, the narration says, "The end comes quickly, and Adam Rock, the warrior despite himself, expects no less." And as Lagana watches this in horror, Swamp Thing reaches out and puts a hand on her shoulder and thinks, "Come on, lady. There's nothing you can do for him now. But we've still got a chance while those soldiers are occupied." So Swamp Thing begins to turn and walk away, but Lagana doesn't move. She just stares, and the narration says, "But as the Swamp Thing lurches into the concealing undergrowth, clearing the way, a look of weary resignation crosses the girl's ebon eyes. And then she sees movement on the ground from Adam, and he's reaching out to her and he's saying, "Lagana, save yourself. I'm gone." Ugh. And then Lagana rushes to him and says, "No, Adam, my fight is over. I'm tired and I'm beaten." And then she falls down next to his body and she grabs his limp hand and she says, "There will be others to come fight the yoke of tyranny, and I'll leave the battle to them. Perhaps they will be wiser than us. Perhaps they will realize there are some things that take more than a mere army to conquer." And as she says this, we see soldiers walk up behind her, and they have their rifles drawn. And then we turn the page and we cut to Swamp Thing, and he turns behind him like he was expecting Lagana to be there, and he thinks, the girl, she stayed behind? I'd better get back before. And then he hears 2 gunshots ring out, because obviously those 2 soldiers executed Lagana. So of course, as Swamp Thing hears those shots, he turns and he starts to go back, but then he pauses, and then he turns back around and he walks into the woods. And the narration says, "For a moment, the startled Swamp Thing hesitates, listening to the final fading echoes of gunfire, and then, shaking his mossy head in sad, helpless understanding, shambles off into the consoling dark of the jungle." Then we cut back to the laboratory where Bolt is being tortured, and we see this panel says, "Otherware number 3," and the text reads, "Reprise, the jungle laboratory." And we see Bolt is passed out in the torture chair, and the scientist is saying to the man in the wheelchair, But sir," and the man in the wheelchair, who is still somewhat shadowed, says, "I don't care if it does turn him into a blasted vegetable. Continue. I must know if the Swamp Thing survives. I owe that monster something, and I can assure you, good doctor, Nathan Ellergy pays his debts." And in this last panel, with that reveal that this is Nathan Ellergy, the leader of the Conclave, and we thought had died in issue 7, we get a full panel of him facing forward, and we see he is now in a wheelchair because of him falling out of the window in issue 7, and it seems like he's wearing almost what looks like a deep-sea diver's suit. There's a bunch of brass plates around his midsection and his legs, and also metal belts and what looks like some sort of controlling mechanism, almost like he needs it to breathe or something. So he looks definitely worse for wear, but he is still alive, and he has captured Bolt and is looking for Swamp Thing, and that is where this issue ends. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.